Parts of it, I might try not to get into the science, but I get passionate about things, and I tend to probably go a little deep. At any time, if you don't understand anything, don't hesitate to ask a question. I will do my best to break it down as the best I can and make sure you understand it. Please, and don't let me move on to something if you haven't understood what we just covered. Like I said, I'm going to try my best not to get too deep and too far into the science with a lot of this, but make sure you guys have some fun and you learn some things. So this is our survival level 1. It's the basic class, and we're going to focus more on the injuries and the mechanisms of injuries that you're going to encounter in a typical sort of our beginning level, sort of bushcraft area. We're not going to go so much into the combat trauma. It's not something you're going to typically find or encounter in sort of your bushcraft survival camping scenarios. What are some ideas of injuries that you might think you might find where you would need first aid in a camping environment or bushcraft environment? Absolutely. Broken legs, sprained ankles, broken bones, and fractures. What else do you think might happen to hurt somebody?
Snake bite.
Snake bites? Absolutely. Cuts and burns. Cuts, burns, sprains, those are going to be the biggest ones. And then also insects and animal bites. Those are the other things you're going to encounter. And there's another one I'm looking for, kind of a big one.
Really falling while your hammock was up?
Yeah, that could definitely happen. It happened last night. What's that? Weather, hypothermia and weather. That's the other one, the body temperature regulation. That's really one of the biggest ones that goes into play that most people never plan or prepare for. And so we're going to go over kind of, everybody's heard of the ABCs of medicine or things, airway, breathing, circulation. Those are always important. Make sure everybody, they're breathing. What's the easiest way to find out if somebody's breathing? Talk to them. If they can talk, guess what? They can breathe. And so that's the easiest way. Just talk to them, and if they can respond, then they're breathing, and their airway is open at the same time. So as soon as they can say something, that's A and B are taken care of right there. Now, if they can't, that's when you would go in a little deeper, and we'll go into that as we get closer. And then so circulation, we're going to start with that because that's usually the biggest and the hardest. Circulation is cuts and where you're bleeding or some form of trauma or something happens that causes bleeding. And it all boils down to one thing. All bleeding stops eventually. So it will stop on its own eventually, whether you do something right or not. Because either it clots or you just run out. True story. It's one of those two things that are going to happen. It's going to clot on its own, or you're going to help it clot and form those clots, or it's going to empty you. It's going to exsanguinate. Sorry, bleed out. So direct pressure stops bleeding. Right there. That's all you need to know for bleeding. Direct pressure stops bleeding, but it's only if you're stopping it at the source. If you think of, you've got your water hose, and everybody's done that, and you kink it, and it stops the flow, it's the same thing we need to do to the bleeding vessel, because that's all it is when whatever you're bleeding from, might be a vein or an artery. Think of that water hose, and it's running. All we need to do is put direct pressure on that broken vessel, and the bleeding's going to stop. All right, and so there's several forms and several techniques that we can do that, and that's by applying pressure with a pressure dressing, or putting manual pressure and squeezing on it with a bandage sitting on top of it, kind of holding that closed. And what you're trying to do is close and squeeze that broken blood vessel in together to hold the blood there long enough to form a clot and include those broken vessels. So that's the purpose of the direct pressure. Whenever you hear kind of level 1, the basic is always apply pressure to the wound, and that is to help start that clot formation and stop the bleeding. And so there's always several techniques, several ways we can, and tools that we can use. Most people have this in most aid bags or first aid kits, and it's called roller gauze. It's Kerlix. In combat, I carried this in ace wraps and tourniquets. That was my favorite thing to work with. the best and easiest way to form a pressure dressing is to find the site, expose it so you can see what you're dealing with to the extent, and then we're gonna wrap it and sort of pack it kind of tight, and then continue to wrap and pack until the bleeding is stopped and monitoring. And so there is several stages. The old school, when I was very first becoming a medic, it was apply a dressing, wait 5 minutes, evaluate, apply a pressure dressing, wait 5 minutes, evaluate, elevate, wait 5 minutes, evaluate, apply a tourniquet. If that's like a major arterial bleed, guess what? Before you go back to reevaluate, they're dead. So through the conflicts that we've been in for a while, we've kind of learned that you don't have that time, and you go straight to a pressure dressing, apply enough pressure to cut off that blood flow to that area, but not to the surrounding tissues. And so anytime you're applying a dressing in the form that we're trying to stop bleeding, you always want to make sure you haven't made a tourniquet unless you need a tourniquet. And we'll cover that here in a bit too. So if Eric has, and we're going to use his tattoo here, is his wound, and he wasn't paying attention and he walked into Danae's cut bubble, and she cut him because he's not supposed to walk in the cut bubble. And so what's the first thing we need to do?
Calm him down.
Talk to him.
Talk to him, absolutely. Hey man, are you okay? And then as soon as he says yes, you're like, stupid, stay out of that cut bubble. No, and so you want to make sure you want to open the site. Take off his shirt or his jacket that's in the area, cut it off if you need to expose it so we can see what we're dealing with. And remember to stay calm. One of the things, and this sounds really cruel, that whenever I was coming on a patient or a trauma victim, I would always, as I was approaching, kind of assess what's going on, look at it, get an idea of what I might be dealing with. As soon as my hands go on, and I would take my knee and I'd start to open my bag and I would look at him and go, thank God that's not me. And that always sort of calmed me down and slowed you down and allowed me to start working. Because what happens is you get wound up and you start the adrenaline rushes and you start trying to force anything and you lose all your fine motor control as soon as you let that happen. You need to stop, think clearly and calmly, and proceed. I'm gonna say proceed intelligently. Think about what you're doing and understand why you're doing it. So I told that last night, I'm gonna harp on it. Our source for bleeding is to stop the bleeding. Direct pressure stops bleeding at the source. So we found Eric's got this nice little cut right here. So I'm gonna take our gauze, and it's not bleeding extremely bad, but we're gonna just apply a little bit of pressure with the bandage. I'm gonna put it right on top, wrap it a good couple of times. All right, how's that feel? Is it feeling better? Good, all right, so, yeah, so we got to the end. I could keep wrapping this, but the whole point of this is I want to stop the bleeding and I want to get a lot of blood to sit there and pull up. And so you take the rest of this, you can leave it rolled up, or you can unroll it, and my favorite technique was to do that, and leave it wadded up, because when you wad it up, it has a greater surface area, more area to absorb, and it's gonna let more blood sit here and form a bigger clot. And from here, then I would use some tape, or we can use an ACE wrap over this, which I'll get in just a second, and apply some pressure to hold pressure here on the wound. But what I want to do before I apply the pressure, the rest of the pressure, is I want to make sure he has a pulse, and we're going to check pulses here in a minute. Make sure I haven't cut off circulation, and evaluate while I was applying this, was he bleeding through, and was the blood just continuing to gush, or did it look like the bleeding was slowing down and stopping at this point? And if that was the case, then I know, all right, I've got enough pressure here and the bleeding is controlled, so now I can go in and get an ACE wrap out. Pack a bunch of those in. Yeah, so then you take from here and we would apply enough pressure to make sure we can hold this using an ACE wrap. is a pressure dressing right there. Doesn't have to be anything fancy, doesn't have to be anything expensive. That was a 20-cent piece of fabric in the nace wrap. And he still has... Pretty good. It's tight. It's actually tourniquet effect with the nace wrap right there. So I made that too tight. So you come back, evaluate. So he doesn't have a distal pulse, or he doesn't have a pulse below. So I've created a tourniquet. So we need to take this off, loosen it up. As we're letting it off, let it off a little more. Yeah, I've done this once or twice. There we go. I feel his pulse again. So, because we don't want it to be a tourniquet yet unless we need it, and then reapply there. And now, recheck. Still got a good strong pulse, and bleeding's controlled. And then we can move on from there. And you scold him about walking into a cup bubble. Make sure he understands. Did you learn anything from this? It's not wrong to